We are going through Rambam's magisterial introduction to Mishnah. It's an enormous treatise, and he delineates all the books of the Mishnah and explains why they are ordered in the sequence that they are. And we decided to spend a little time to go through each one of the books that make up the corpus of oral Torah of the Mishnah and give a little bit of an overview of each one of these books and its contents. We spoke about how there are 60 plus books in the Mishnah, divided up into 6 orders, into Shisha Sidarim. And we spoke about the order of planting, of agriculture, the Seder, the order of Zeraim, and its 11 books. And today we're going to talk about the next order, that of Moed, that of festivals, the set of books, the set of Mishnahs that orient around special days. It's absolutely massive. 12 books of Mishnah. Each book of Mishnah has a companion work of Talmud, which of course elaborates and expands upon the Mishnah. And today we're going to go through it all in one sitting, a brief overview of each of these 12 amazing books of Mishnah. And maybe also a little sample teaching from the Mishnah to get the tiniest of drops of flavors of this part of Torah. And of course, the first book that begins the Seder Moed, the second order of Mishnah, that of festivals, is Shabbos. An enormous book, 24 chapters. Why is Shabbos the first? So the Rambam, in his introduction to Mishnah, he gives a variety of reasons. He says, well, Shabbos is the most important of the festivals, and it's the most common of festivals, and it's organized in the Torah. When the Torah delineates all the festivals, it starts off with Shabbos, and therefore Rabbi Judah the Prince, the architect of the Mishnah, when he organized all of Torah into different books and into different sections, the first of Seder Moed, of the order of festivals, is Maseches Shabbos, the book of Shabbos. Now, of course, we know about Shabbos. It's a central part of the Torah. It's mentioned many, many times in the Torah. It's, of course, in the 10 Commandments, and it really harkens back all the way to chapter 1 of Genesis. God created over the course of 6 days. God ceased to create. He rested, so to speak, on day 7. And when we rest on day 7, we embody, or we project with ourselves, the faith in God and in His creation. And that's why it is so central, because it is a testimony that we do where we bear witness to Genesis and to our faith. Of course, it's in the 10 Commandments, and it's quite interesting to observe that the 10 Commandments are mentioned twice in the Torah, once in the book of Exodus, once in the book of Devarim, where Moshe, at the end of his life, at the end of the Torah, he repeats many of the laws of the Torah. In fact, Deuteronomy actually means the repetition of Torah, and there is a bit of a difference when he details the 10 Commandments for the second time. It's a bit different. Commandment number 4 is different. In one, it says, Zachor es Yom HaShabbos HaKadsho, remember the Shabbos to sanctify it. In the second, it says, Shamar, guard, observe the Shabbos to sanctify it. And of course, the Talmud tells us, Zachar v'Shamar, Shamar v'Zachar, they're both said at once. They were conveyed in prophetic manner, in a manner that we are not capable of doing. We cannot say 2 words at once. We cannot hear 2 words at once. But Sinai was different. It was prophecy, and the words of Zachar and Shamar were said together, and they were heard at the same time. And that really symbolizes the goal of this day. It's A, something we're supposed to do to sanctify it, and B, something that we're supposed to refrain from doing. We're supposed to guard and observe all of its laws, namely, not to do work. Now, of course, what does work mean? If we have nebulous words and they're subject to every individual's interpretation, we'll have as many Torahs as there are opinions. So, of course, when the Almighty conveyed the Torah to Moshe at Sinai, He gave him all the details. Nevertheless, as we mentioned in the past, it's all hinted to in Scripture. The Torah tells us multiple times that we must build a tabernacle, and it tells us we cannot build it on Shabbos, and thus we can deduce from this teaching in the Torah that the building of the tabernacle and every part of the building of the tabernacle is a violation of Shabbos. And thus you can deconstruct all the laws of Shabbos by figuring out exactly what you need to do. Every single step of building the tabernacle, that will be its own violation of Shabbos. And thus, the Mishnah tells us in the book of Shabbos, there are 39 different categories of work, categories of different sorts of activities that is the unbundling of the building of the tabernacle. And each one of them is a central category of work prohibited on Shabbos. Now, we are going to try to cover a little bit of it. We're not going to go through all 39 categories, and we're certainly not going to talk about the entire scope of Shabbos. It is quite large, and that's just the Mishnah, 24 chapters. And then there's the Talmud, 150 plus pages of Talmud, and myriads of books. The halachic literature of Shabbos is basically endless. So we're just going to try to do a little flavor. There are 39 categories of prohibited work. Each category has a subcategory, or many, even multiple subcategories. So, for example, the first of the prohibited activities on Shabbos is to plant. Now, where exactly does planting, where was that part of the tabernacle? Well, part of the tabernacle is you have to have the showbreads, the lechem hapanim, upon the table, upon the shulchan. Well, how do you have showbreads? You have to have bread. Well, how do you have bread? Well, you have to have flour. Well, how do you get flour? You have to have wheat. Well, how do you get wheat? Well, you got to plant it. And therefore, part of the things needed for the tabernacle is planting. You need it for the showbread. You need it to make the materials for the dyes, for the fabrics. Planting is a category of work prohibited on Shabbos. So what does planting mean? Planting is an activity that you do to promote, to advance vegetation to grow. So to plant means to put a seed in the ground, of course, but the concept of planting is to advance the growth of vegetation. And therefore, if someone pours water upon grass or a tree or vegetation or crops or whatever it may be, that too is accomplishing the same goal of planting, namely to advance the growth of something from the ground, and therefore that would not be a headline category of work, but a subcategory under the rubric of planting. Now, of course, Shabbos is a very serious subject. The Torah tells us, Mechalaleha mos yumas, those who violate the Shabbos are guilty of a capital offense, and even someone who does a violation of Shabbos inadvertently must bring a sin sacrifice. If you look at the entire book of Shabbos, you will find four main subjects: the prohibitions of Shabbos that are prohibited by the Torah itself. Then there's the vast body of Shabbos law that was enacted by the rabbis, by the sages, the different edicts and decrees. So things prohibited by the Torah, things prohibited by the rabbis. What must you do on Shabbos is topic number 3, the performative responsibilities on Shabbos. And number 4 are things that you are allowed to do on Shabbos, even though you may have thought they would be prohibited. So, for example, things that you could do for a mitzvah under certain circumstances, things that are done for a mitzvah or in honor of Shabbos, or things, of course, pikuach nefesh, to save a life, things that you would have thought that maybe would be prohibited and are actually permitted. That's the 4th subject on Shabbos. In the book of Shabbos, so for example, a baby is born on Shabbos, the circumcision is on Shabbos, and that, you would imagine, is a violation of Shabbos. Because to draw blood, to cause an injury, to cause a wound, is a subcategory of one of the categories of prohibited work on Shabbos. And therefore, what do? You have to circumcise on day 8, but day 8 is Shabbos, and you can't circumcise on Shabbos. We have an irreconcilable conflict. So, of course, we know the halacha. Ubiyoma Shmini, on the 8th day, the Torah tells us the circumcision happens, even if it is on Shabbos. The beginning of the book of Shabbos talks about the laws of carrying items from one domain to another. One of the 39 categories of work is hotzah, is to take something out of your house, let's say, and to bring it into the public domain, or vice versa, or even transporting something within a public domain. And the Mishnah in chapter 1, Mishnah number 3, tells about how if someone is a tailor, and they're always carrying their tailoring paraphernalia, they are required to remove those items from their pockets before Shabbos, lest they forget and walk out on Shabbos and they're carrying all their gear and they are inadvertently transporting items in their pockets from one domain to another and within a public domain. So a scribe cannot use his quill, or has to remove his quill from his pockets, and so on. And then it tells us a very interesting law. You are prohibited, the rabbis prohibited the reading from the light of a lamp. Now, a lamp today means one thing. A lamp in the Mishnah's time meant that there was a little receptacle of oil with a little wick. And you light the wick, and that gives you light. We are not familiar with darkness so much because we have electricity. But really, the way things were without electricity is that at night it's just completely dark unless you have a candle or a torch, of course. Well, suppose it's Friday night. I want to study. Well, it's dark. My books cannot be read in the dark. So I'll just make a little candle, a little lamp, and I'll read. Well, here's the problem. The sages were concerned. What happens when the light's flickering and you want to maneuver the little receptacle so that way the wick is actually in the oil? You want to kind of pull the oil to one side of the receptacle, and that will be a violation of Shabbos. And therefore the sages said you should not read at all unless there's someone watching you to make sure that you don't actually tip it. You cannot read to the light of a lamp. And then the Talmud says something very interesting. But if a person is a very distinguished person, they would never start fiddling around with the lamp. They're a noble person. They're a prestigious person. Even during the week, they would never touch, they don't get their hands dirty to touch a lamp. Well, according to one opinion of the Talmud, the sages did not enact the decree upon such a person. And the Talmud says, what, is that true? We have a story. One of the great sages, Rabbi Ishmael, he said, I'm not worried about this decree of the rabbis. I'll read. I'll study Torah. It's the most important mitzvah, after all. I'll study Torah to the light of a lamp, and I'll make sure I won't tip it. I'll be extra vigilant. And once it happened, he was reading, and he was so engrossed in the study, but the light was a little bit faint. So he reached to go tip it, and he stopped at the last second. And he said, aha, I should not have been so lax, so flippant, so cavalier about the words of the sages. How great are the words of the sages that they said to not read by the light of the lamp. And the Talmud offers a different version of the events that happened. According to one opinion, the events were thusly. He read, and he actually tipped the vessel and pulled the oil and violated the Shabbos inadvertently. And he wrote upon his journal, I, Ishmael, son of Elisha, I read, and I tipped the oil. And when the temple is rebuilt, I will bring a sin sacrifice with a large animal to atone for my violation of Shabbos. And the Talmud has a very interesting conclusion to this. The Talmud says, this is an exception, meaning the original ruling that said that someone who is an important person can read to the light of a candle, of a lamp, that's still true. Rabbi Ishmael, son of Elisha, he was the exception to this rule. He was exception to the exception. Why? Because he loved Torah so much that he didn't care about the fact that it was not befitting someone of his stature to actually maneuver the lamp. The book of Shabbos, an enormous book. Let's move on to book number 2 of this section of Mishnah, the book of Eruvin. Eruvin is primarily about the laws of Shabbos as well. As we mentioned earlier, the last of the 39 categories of work is to transport something either from one domain to another, from a public domain to a private domain, from a private domain to a public domain, or to carry within a public domain. So a lot of those laws are further explicated in the book of Eruvin. There are 4 different types of domain. What is the definition of a private domain? We think of a private domain as some place where individual, like private property. It's not quite private property. It's an area enclosed by partitions that are at least 10 tfachim, 10 hand breadths tall. Well, what's a partition? How do you define a partition? How do you make a partition? And so on. A public domain, it's an area that is a certain width. It's got to be at least 16 cubits wide. It's got to be open at both ends. It may require a certain amount of daily passerby. Now, this book is a book that a lot of people are scared of. It's very technical, and it requires some visuospatial intelligence. And there are many books today that are commentaries, but also aids and guides in the study of this book that offer graphics and diagrams and visuals to help make it a bit more easy. The verse tells us that Messiah will be compared to a pauper riding on a donkey. Abraham rode a donkey. Moshe rode a donkey. Messiah will ride a donkey. But it'll be a pauper. The word pauper in Hebrew is an ani, spelled ayin, nun, yud. And our sages tell us that this represents the 3 most challenging books of Talmud. The ayin stands for Eruvin, the nun stands for Nida, and the yud stands for Yevamos. Now, we haven't gotten to Nida Yevamos. They are coming soon, but these are some of the more challenging books, and people are scared of them. And people forget that the Torah is our heritage. We cannot be scared of any part of Torah. But what's implied from this teaching of our sages is that when our nation accepts upon themselves to study these 3 more challenging books, well, that is something that can lead towards the expediting of the Messiah. So how do you make a partition? A wall that sections off private domains from public domains. If it's a private domain, you can carry in it. You can transport items in a private domain. Well, that's done with a mechitza, with a partition. The laws of Eruv Techumim, the Torah tells us that even if you're not carrying anything, you're not allowed to walk more than 2,000 amos, 2,000 cubits outside of a city. So suppose you have a city and you want to take a little stroll outside the city, you can do it up to 2,000 amos, up to 2,000 cubits. If you want to extend those 2,000 cubits, a cubit, think of it as 2 feet, even though it's not quite 2 feet. There's a way to extend the parameters, the boundaries of the city, or the halachic boundaries of how far you're allowed to walk outside of a city by something called the Eruv Techumim, which basically means is that you make a little station outside the city, a station which is like a residence. You put food there, enough for a few meals, and that becomes like a halachic residence, and thus it extends the end point of the city 2,000 amos past that. So if you want, let's say, put 2,000 amos outside of a city, you put this Eruv Techumim, this halachic device that creates a halachic residence, and thus it extends the boundaries of the city, you can actually go 2,000 amos even further. And there's another law known as Eruve Chatzeros, which is a halachic device, a means by which multiple residences can merge together into one private domain. If you have multiple houses in a general courtyard, there's a way by which that can all be fused into one halachic domain, and the transportation of items can be done across that courtyard because it is now one private domain, not multiple different domains. A very interesting Mishnah appears in chapter 10 of this book. You are outside the city, or you're in a place where it's public domain. So in public domain, you cannot lift something and walk it. You cannot carry something. What if someone finds a pair of tefillin? Phylacteries. And it's just strewn about, and no one's watching it. And it's a terrible disgrace to this wonderful mitzvah. What do? It's Shabbos. You can't just lift it and carry it. You can't violate the Shabbos. To transport the tefillin to a safe location. So what do? You can't leave it there. So you may think that, Shabbos, you're allowed to wear garments. I'm allowed to wear a garment, a shirt on Shabbos. I'm not carrying the shirt, I'm wearing it. So maybe I could take the tefillin and wear it as a garment and therefore transport it to safety via wearing it, not via carrying it. And if you have that idea, you are actually correct, because that's the solution that the Mishnah tells us. You find, let's say, 10 pairs of tefillin, you put one on, the tefillin on your head, tefillin on your arm, and you bring it in to the city. And you walk into your house and you place it there safely. And you go back out. And you do pair at a time, one pair at a time. You wear it, even though typically we don't wear tefillin on Shabbos. This will be an exception, where you're allowed to wear it, to don the tefillin and wear it, and thus transport these items of a mitzvah to a safe location. Comes along Rabbi Gamliel and says, no, you don't wear one pair of tefillin at a time. There's 10 there. You wear 2 at a time. So you would have only 5 trips back and forth. Now, what's the dispute? Why 1 or 2? And there's a very interesting debate. We're not going to get into it. Why you, according to one opinion, you can only wear 1 at a time. According to the second opinion, you can wear 2 at a time. One opinion says, well, Shabbos is really a day that you're supposed to wear tefillin. So why don't we wear tefillin on Shabbos? For some other reason. Well, if you're supposed to wear tefillin, then you can wear tefillin on Shabbos, but you can't wear 2 because that would be a problem of Baal Tosif, meaning that you're supposed to wear tefillin, but you're not supposed to wear 2 pairs of tefillin. And therefore, the permission to transport the tefillin back to safety is because this is an example of when you're allowed to wear tefillin on Shabbos. But you're allowed to wear tefillin only 1, not 2. Comes along the second opinion and says, no, tefillin you're not supposed to wear on Shabbos. So therefore, there is this carve out to save it from the disgrace of being strewn about, and therefore you're allowed to wear 2 because that's not a problem it's not a tefillin related problem of wearing more than you are supposed to wear. Very intricate dispute. What happens if you find loads of them? What happens if it's dangerous to be out and about? Very interesting Mishnah. Again, a tiny little drop in the bucket. Let's move on to the next book. Pesachim. Pesach. Pesach. It's the first of the festivals. When the Torah delineates all the festivals, it starts off with Shabbos, moves on to Pesach. So Shabbos and Eruvin talks about the laws of Shabbos, but right afterwards you have the book of Pesachim, Pesach, of Passover, that is the next in line. So of course, on Passover, you must not eat chametz. You must not own chametz. You must not benefit from chametz, from leavened bread. You must search and eradicate any bit of chametz from your house. All those laws are found in the book of Pesachim. What is chametz? How do you define it? What are the rabbinic parameters of chametz? On Passover, there's also the paschal offering, all the laws of the paschal offering. Of course, today, we don't have a paschal offering. We still have to eat matzah and avoid chametz. But there's also, of course, the Seder night. The night of Passover, the first night of Passover, first 2 in the diaspora. All the laws of that are also detailed in this book. There's a very famous Mishnah in chapter 10 of the book of Pesachim. Rabban Gamliel, the great Rabban Gamliel. Now, most sages in the Mishnah are called rabbi. Rabban is reserved for the rabbi, meaning the prince, like the leader of Jewish people, has a more distinguished title, the honorific of Rabban. Very rare in the Mishnah to see that. Usually it's just Rabbi, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tafron, Rabbi Yudah, and so on. This is Rabban Gamliel. He's from the family of Hillel. He's from the Nasi. He's the president of the Jewish people. He has that special title. And he says that there are three things to mention, meaning to understand, in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Passover. And they are Pesach, Matzah, and Marar. Pesach means the paschal offering, to understand that. God passed over our homes in Egypt while he struck the Egyptians, and that is remembered and relived via the paschal offering. The matzah, that symbolizes the Exodus, and of course the marar, the bitter herbs, that reminds us of the suffering and the bitterness of enslavement. And the Mishnah continues that even though it's been more than 3,000 years since the Exodus, that's a long time. Nevertheless, in every single generation, there is an obligation for every person to view themselves as if they themselves were someone who was saved from Egypt, someone who left Egypt, someone who experienced the Exodus themselves. And the Mishnah quotes a verse. The verse tells us, right after the Exodus, in Exodus chapter 13, on this day, meaning the day of the Exodus, you should tell your son about the Exodus. And you should say, God did this for me when I left Egypt. What do you mean I left Egypt? I'd never been to Egypt. No, in every generation, everyone must view themselves as if they were in Egypt, they were enslaved, and they were freed. And the Mishnah continues with the citation from the Haggadah. Therefore, we must thank and praise and glorify and extol and exalt and honor and bless and revere and laud the Almighty, who did to our forefathers and to us all these wonderful miracles. He took us out of slavery to freedom, from anguish to joy, from sorrow to days of delight, and from darkness to great light, and from enslavement to redemption. This is part of the text of the Haggadah, where we relive it. We relive the Exodus, and we thank God for all the miracles He did for us and for our ancestors. The third book of the Order of Moed, that's Pesachim, and it continues with the book of Shkalim. In Israel, the currency is the shekel. Well, where does that come from? It comes from the Torah. The Torah talks about the shekel, the half shekel. This is a measurement of silver, but it's also a coin, a currency. And the Torah tells us that every single year there is a census that doubles as a fundraiser. Every adult male is required, whether they're rich or poor, whether they live in Israel or in the diaspora, they're required to give a half shekel for the temple coffers. This half shekel donation, pooled together from all the adult males of the nation, that would be used to pay for communal sacrifices every day. There's the Atonement offering of the morning, the Atonement offering of the afternoon, and of course, on festivals, there's a special Musaf offering. Where is that money come from? Who's paying for that? Well, it's got to be the community. Well, everyone contributes the half shekel once a year, and that is used for this purpose, for the procurement of the sacrifices done by the community. This was done at one particular part of the year. On the first day of Adar, Adar is the month before Nisan, and it, even though it really relates to sacrifices, it's included in the book of times of festivals because it was done at a specific time in the year. It was done on the first day of Adar. And the Rambam tells us why is Shkalim featured over here, because if you look at the order in which it's told in the Torah, it follows the same order. Now, what's really interesting, I mentioned at the beginning that each one of these books of Mishnah has a companion work in the Talmud. Now, as we know, the Talmud project, this enormous project of not just having the Mishnah, the laws, but also all the details and expanding upon all the details of the laws of the Mishnah, it was done twice. There's the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud Bavli, and there's the Jerusalem Talmud, the Talmud Yerushalmi. And there are some books that don't have Talmud. And there's some books that have the Talmud Bavli, but not the Talmud Yerushalmi. And there's some books that have the Talmud Yerushalmi, but not the Talmud Bavli. So it's a bit confusing. But this book, the book of Shkalim, it is one of the books that has only Talmud Yerushalmi, only the Jerusalem Talmud, and not the Babylonian Talmud. But traditionally, and when we say traditionally, we mean it's been like this for a long time. For more than 1,000 years, there's the custom of including the book of Jerusalem Talmud of Shekalim together with the Babylonian Talmud. Typically, if you want to study Talmud, it means you want to study the Babylonian Talmud. And that means you'll study the books of the Talmud that are featured in the Babylonian Talmud. And you will omit the books of Talmud featured in the Jerusalem Talmud. The one exception to that, for some reason, and there's reasons for it, of course, is the book of Shkalim, that even though you're studying the Babylonian Talmud, included in that is the Jerusalem volume of the book of Shkalim. Now, I selected some very interesting teachings from this book. In chapter 6, it tells us that in the temple, there were 13 chests shaped like horns. It's narrow on the top and it's big on the bottom. Narrow on the top, big on the bottom. And the money that was collected, the half shekels, they were placed inside these receptacles. And the reason why they were done like that, like why would you put the money in such a vessel where it's narrow on top and it's wide on the bottom? Because if someone wanted to be a thief, they don't want to stick their hands in, I'm dropping in my half shekel. And they put their hands in and they grab a fistful of shekels themselves, half shekels themselves. And like, I'm putting in my donation. But they're really pocketing and stealing. Well, that's a big problem. So you can only put in, but you can't take out. It's a one-way street. It's very narrow on top. You can't stick your hands in, and then it collects the pools in the bottom. Okay, that's an interesting law. And there were 13 of them. Why 13? Got to see the Talmud. There were also 13 tables in the temple. And there were 13 prostrations in the temple. 13 times they bowed in the temple. But the family of Rabban Gamliel and the family of Rabbi Chanina Sagana Kohanim, Rabbi Chanina the vice Kohen Gadol, they would have not 13 prostrations, but 14 prostrations. Now again, you read the Mishnah, you're like, I need more details. Like, it just says there's 13 horns, there's 13 horn-shaped chests. We don't know anything about that. Like why, how was it done, and so on. All the details are omitted from the Mishnah, included in the Talmud. 13 tables, what does that mean? Doesn't say anything. The Mishnah is very pithy, it's very succinct. It just tells us what the law was. There's 13 tables. What does that mean? We don't know. You got to open up the Talmud. There's 13 prostrations. What does that mean? Where are they all done? Why are they different? Why is the family of Rabbi Gamliel and that of Rabbi Chanina Kohanim, why do they have a 14th prostration? So all that's included in the Talmud. But the Mishnah does say where the 14th prostration was done. It was done near the wood depository. Now, what is the wood depository? Well, the wood depository is a depository where they kept wood. Up upon the altar were fires, ever-present fires. 1, 2, 3, 4 different times had different amounts of fires, and those fires were kept continuously burning with wood sourced from the wood depository. Part of the temple grounds included a room that was the depository of wood. You would take wood from the wood depository and place it upon the altar. And that's where the 14th prostration was done towards. Why? Because there was a tradition from our fathers that in the wood depository is where the Ark of the Covenant, was hidden, was sequestered. In the Second Temple, many of the components of the temple in normative times, in the First Temple, were not present, including the Ark of the Covenant. It was hidden. We don't know exactly where. But there's a tradition it was placed somewhere in the wood depository. And it tells us a story that there was a Kohen, there was a priest, who was going about his business in the wood depository. And he saw a tile that seemed to be a bit off. There was something odd about that tile. It was different than the other tiles. And he said, we have to investigate that. We got to find out what's going on. Why is there this misaligned tile? And he ran out to his friends, I got to show you something. And he's right over there. And as he was pointing, collapsed dead on the floor. And everyone knew that he wanted to point where that tile was. And the reason why he had to die is because behind that was hidden the Ark, and it was not supposed to be revealed. Very interesting Mishnah in the book of Shtelem. Let's move on to the next book, the book of Yoma. The word Yoma means day, the day. Which day is being talked about over here? The greatest day of them all. Yom HaKippurim, Yom Kippur, as it is known. In the Torah, the organization of the laws of Shtelem, of the half shekel donation, is before that of Yom Kippur, and therefore it is thus organized in the Torah. Well, Yom Kippur, there's lots of preparation. The high priest has to do all the service on Yom Kippur. Very, very detailed service that he has to do. All that's detailed in this book, the preparation of the high priest for Yom Kippur. Of course, for us, there's the fasting on Yom Kippur. And the last chapter is all about the laws of fasting on Yom Kippur. This is the only fast day that is of biblical origin. The Torah tells us we cannot eat on Yom Kippur. Well, what if there's a woman who is pregnant and she's more physically vulnerable and she has a craving and it happens to be Yom Kippur and there's a concern that if she doesn't eat, she'll be in danger, or maybe her child in utero will be in danger. May she eat? May she not eat? The Mishnah tells us, Ma'achilin osa, we feed her until her equilibrium is restored. What if there's a sick person? Well, some sick people, they cannot fast for 25 hours, risk-free. So we have to ask experts, we have to consult with experts to find out, is this person's condition one that warrants the violation of the fast of Yom Kippur? Well, suppose there are no experts. Vim ein sham bekim, there's no experts. Well, then we have to follow the advice or the words of the patient themselves. If he says, I must eat, I must drink, we feed them, we give them to drink. Ad sheyomar die, until he says, I've had enough. And once the Mishnah talks about situations where there's a risk of a person's life, it proceeds to talk about all sorts of other situations of that sort. Someone who has a sickness, a bulmus in the words of the Mishnah, and they can only be healed with non-kosher, either because they need food, there's no kosher food around, or the particular illness that they have must be remediated with non-kosher food. They can be fed that non-kosher food because, again, there's the prioritization of saving the life. And then it says, well, what if someone is bitten by a mad dog? And it used to be that there was a belief that the way to avoid the consequences, I guess we would call it today rabies maybe, of being bit by the mad dog is to feed the patient from the lobe of the liver of that same mad dog. Can you do that? Dog's not kosher. Says the Mishnah, you don't do that. It was thought to be a remedy. The sages said that's not actually going to help the patient. and therefore you cannot violate the law against eating dogs, or cats for that matter, in order to save it. You could do to save a life, but this is not going to help saving a life. Comes along a second opinion who says, well, it is permitted. The second opinion is the individual sage who is of the opinion that it would be beneficial to potentially save the person who was bitten by the mad dog, and therefore you'll be allowed to feed that patient from the lobe of the liver of that same dog that bit him. And then it tells us another law. Even though on Shabbos we don't do medicine, again, medicine provided that it's not going to save a life. If it's going to save a life, we would do the medicine. But in general, one of the subcategories of laws prohibited or of activities prohibited on Shabbos is to do medicine. In a case where someone has a particular illness, we can place medicine in their throat because there's a chance that we're saving a life. Meaning, the Torah that tells us that we must prioritize a life over, let's say, the laws of Shabbos, that's not only if we're definitely saving a life, but even if we're potentially saving a life. And the Mishnah continues, like if there's a building that collapses, we don't know if the people in there or not. We have no idea. Are we allowed to clear away the rubble, violating the Shabbos, to potentially save a life? The answer is yes. And of course, once you have these laws in the Mishnah, you open up the Talmud, and there is a very long and intricate discussion about all the details of Pikuach Nefesh, of the suspension of Torah laws to save a life. Following the book of Yoma, we have the book of Sukkah, which of course talks about the festival of Sukkot, of Sukkos. To make a sukkah, to dwell inside of a sukkah, the laws of lulav and esrod, the 4 species that we shake on the festival, the specific laws related to the sacrifices of Sukkot, the festivities done in the temple, the Sukkos and Pesach, the laws of the Arava, the Nisach Hamayim, the libation of the water. All the laws of the festival of Sukkot are included in the book of Sukkah, and it starts off, the height of Sukkah. If the sukkah is more than 20 cubits tall, it's not a kosher sukkah. If it's not a minimum of 10 hand breadths tall, it's also not a sukkah. It has to have a minimum of 3 walls. And it cannot have more sunlight than shade. And it cannot be an old sukkah, according to one opinion. What does it mean, an old sukkah? Which means you have a leftover sukkah. You made it in the summer, a little gazebo. And you just kept it there because you're lazy. And you don't want to take it down. Oh, now it's the festival of Sukkos. Let me just use my gazebo. It has 3 walls. It has a shade. It has the right materials. No, because you didn't make it for the festival of Sukkot, according to one opinion, it is not usable for the festival if it was done more than 30 days prior. And then it continues, if your sukkah is underneath a tree, so it's not directly underneath the sky, it's as if you made it indoors. If you make one sukkah on top of another sukkah, it's a 2-layer, a duplex sukkah. The top one's kosher because that is underneath the sky. The bottom one is not kosher because that's underneath the floor of the top sukkah. Now, of course, this is just a drop in the bucket. If you study the entire book of Sukkah, the Mishnah and the Talmud, you'll find dozens and dozens, scores and scores of different types of sukkahs, either that are kosher or are not kosher. And there's a very famous idea from the Gaon of Vilna. The word sukkah in the Torah is spelled sometimes with a vav, sometimes without a vav. So how do you spell the word sukkah? Samach, chaf, hey, or samach vav chaf hey. So does it have the vav or not have the vav? Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. The gematria of those 2 words are 91 and 85. Says the Gaon of Vilna, if you count up all the different types of sukkahs, those that are good and those that are not good, they'll equal the good ones, and the not good ones will equal 85 and 91 respectively, corresponding to sometimes the Torah spelling those words with vav and without. My wife, before we got married, she did a project. She did a project where she made these little stick figurine sukkahs, like out of popsicle woods, like arts and crafts, right? So she made them like, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 different sukkahs with the shape of the ones that are kosher and the ones that are not kosher. And it's in this incredible display that my in-laws keep in their sukkah. And I have plans. I have a scheme to pilfer it. If my wife made it, why do my in-laws have it? And they proudly display it in their sukkah. We should steal it. We should grab it back to its rightful owner. Maybe one day. The next book is called Beitza. Beitza means egg, an egg. So this book is not about eggs. It's about festivals in general. And that's why some of the classic commentators call the book not Maseches Beitza, but they call it instead Maseches Yom Tov, the festival of Yom Tov. And this is about the prohibition of doing work on festivals, not just on Shabbos. It's prohibited to do work. We don't do work on festivals either. But there are some categories of work that are permitted to be done on the festivals. For example, certain categories of work prohibited across the board on Shabbos are permitted on festivals for the sake of ochel nefesh, of food. So you, under certain circumstances, you'll let her cook on Yom Tov, on festivals. Why? Because that's what the Torah tells us. That the exception of ochel nefesh, of things that you want to do to cook, to provide food for the festival, may be permitted. But what about if the festival's on a Friday, and then after Friday comes Shabbos? Are you allowed to cook on the festival, not for the sake of the festival, but for the sake of Shabbos? We have the Mishnah, the first Mishnah, the second chapter of the book of Beitza. Yom Tov Shechalios Erev Shabbos. The festival, that's on Friday. Am I allowed to cook on the festival in a manner permitted to cook on the festival for the sake of the festival? Am I allowed to cook on the festival for the sake of Shabbos? And the answer is, well, sort of, maybe. If I'm cooking for the festival, so it's Friday, I'm cooking in a permitted manner for Friday lunch, for the festival lunch, I can make a little bit extra of that same food and eat that on Shabbos. So it's kind of like I'm cooking for the festival, but I'm making a little bit extra, and that can be used on Shabbos. Or there's another workaround known as the Eruv Tavshilin. If I started preparing for Shabbos before the festival, meaning on Thursday, it's not yet the festival, and I started preparing for Shabbos, and I made 1 or 2 dishes for Shabbos before the festival, then you'll have to do work on the festival to prepare for Shabbos. This is known as Eruv Tavshilin. If you're counting, we've had 3 Eruvs mentioned: Eruv Tchumim, Eruv Chaseros, and now Eruv Tavshilin, different types of Eruvs. And then we continue. Book of Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, of course, is the first day of the year, but there's really 4 different days that are the first of the year. For what? First year for what? So when we say the word Rosh Hashanah, we typically mean Rosh Hashanah for humanity, for the world. We're all judged on Rosh Hashanah. Well, there are different days that are the first day of the year for different categories. And thus the book begins. There are 4 Rosh Hashanahs, different dates of the year for different subjects. And that's the beginning of the book. And then it talks about, well, Rosh Hashanah, it's a calendar. How do you deal with the calendar? How do you sanctify the new moon? How do you determine when the next month begins and the previous month ends? We know that a lunar month, it's 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, and a couple of seconds. So when exactly, if 29 and a half days, that's not exactly a full day. So some months will skew shorter. It'll be a 29-day month. And day 30 will be the first day of the next month. And some months will skew longer, meaning the month will be 30 days, and day 31 will be the first day of the next month. How do you figure all that? That's detailed. The astronomical calculations plus the testimony of the witnesses that are accepted for Kiddush HaChodesh for the sanctification of the month, how they are investigated, how they are verified, and so on. All that's detailed in the book of Rosh Hashanah. On Rosh Hashanah, of course, we blow the shofar. Well, what makes a kosher shofar? How do you blow it? And so on. The prayers of the day. And there's a very interesting Mishnah in the 3rd chapter of the book of Rosh Hashanah. It talks about someone blowing the shofar. Into a pit, into a ditch, into a barrel. You have to hear the shofar on the festival of Rosh Hashanah. What if someone's blowing it into a pit and there's this whole cacophonous echo? Did you hear the shofar or not? Well, it depends. If you heard the sound of the shofar, then you have discharged your obligation. You have fulfilled your obligation. But if you just hear the sound of the echo, well, the Torah tells us you have to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, not the sound of the echo of the shofar. So you have not fulfilled your obligation. You have not discharged your responsibility. Well, what if someone's taking a stroll? They're going for a walk. And they happen to walk by the synagogue as the synagogue is blowing the shofar. So they're in the middle of their stroll, and they hear the sound of the shofar. Have they fulfilled their responsibility? Or not? Says the Mishnah, it depends. If they have intention to fulfill the mitzvah of hearing the sounds of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, they have fulfilled the responsibility. But if they have not had intention, they haven't thought that, say, okay, I'm having intention now to fulfill my mitzvah, then they have not fulfilled their mitzvah. 2 people walk by the shul, and they both hear the exact same sounds. One of them can fulfill his mitzvah, one of them does not fulfill his mitzvah, one has intention, one does not have intention. You open up the Talmud, and there's a whole discussion about the subject of intentionality. Someone blows the shofar, not to fulfill the mitzvah, to practice. I want to make a nice song. My shofar is my trumpet. Well, if you're doing it for the sake of the mitzvah, you fulfill the mitzvah. If you're doing it to practice or for a song, you haven't had the intentionality to fulfill the mitzvah, you did not fulfill your obligation. Someone is an expert to fit Torah scrolls. And they're in the book of Deuteronomy. And they're reading the words, making sure that there's no letters missing and there's no extra letters and there's no mistakes. You happen to be reading the Torah. You're inspecting it to make sure it's kosher. It's got every letter. Has no extra letters. Not missing any letters. And you read the words, Shema Yisrael, Hashem, you read the Shema. Did you fulfill the mitzvah of reciting the Shema? Twice a day, in the morning and at night? Must you have intentionality for the mitzvah? You eat matzah. It's a nice cracker. You don't think about the obligation to eat matzah. Did you fulfill your mitzvah? That is a discussion found in many places in the Talmud, including in the book of Rosh Hashanah, and we proceed. The book of Tainus that talks about fast days. There are 6 fast days in the Jewish calendar. Of course, only one of them is in the Torah. That is Yom Kippur. The other 5, or at least most of the other 5, are because of calamities that befell our people. We have the fast of Gedaliah, which was instituted after the assassination of the Jewish governor of Judea. That was effectively the death knell of Jewish sovereignty over the land. The 10th of Teves, the encirclement of Jerusalem. The fast of Esther, the 17th of Tammuz, and the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. Most of the book is about other fast days, namely the fast days instituted for droughts. When there's no rain, there are special prayers that are instituted to try to beseech God to give us rain. When there's no rain, there are fast days that are instituted to beseech God, to pray, so that He gives us rain. At the end of the book, it talks about some of the other fast days, and it tells us that there are 5 things that happened on the 17th day of Tammuz that we mark with a fast day. And there are 5 things that happened on the 9th day of the month of Av that again we mark with a fast day. On the 17th day of Tammuz, Moshe shattered the luchos, the tablets. On the 17th day of Tammuz, the daily Tamid offering ceased. The walls of Jerusalem were breached. Apustamus, some person, we don't know exactly who that is, he burned a Torah scroll. And an idol was erected in the temple. Those 5 terrible calamities happened all on this day, and thus we fast on the 17th day of Tammuz. On Tisha B'Av, 5 terrible things happened to our forefathers. In the aftermath of the sin of the spies, it was decreed upon our forefathers that they will not enter the land. That happened on the 9th day of the month of Av. First temple was destroyed. Second temple was destroyed. Beitar, the city of Beitar, was destroyed. And Temple Mount was raised spelled with a Z. These 5 calamities happened on the 9th day of Av, and of course we fast on this day. Moreover, the Mishnah tells us, Mishenichnas Av, when the month of Av begins, we diminish in our joy. These are sad, somber days, and thus we dial back the joy that we typically have at a fever pitch, because how could we not be joyous? During the month of Av, we dial that down. And then it continues. The Mishnah tells us that those are sad days, but we also have happy days. And the 2 happiest days of the year are the 15th day of the month of Av, Tu B'Av, and Yom Kippur. Why are these days of joy? The Jewish people in the wilderness, they died over the course of 40 years. The last day that they died was the 15th day of Av. Jeroboam, the renegade king of Israel, he instituted guards to prevent the members of his kingdom of Israel from going down to Jerusalem, and he removed them on the 15th day of Av. And the people slaughtered by the Romans in Beitar and allowed to rot and not be buried for a long time were allowed to be buried on the 15th day of Av. The aforementioned wood in the wood depository was finished, meaning they brought it all into the wood depository every year on the 15th day of Av. Happy days. Yom Kippur, we think of Yom Kippur as a sad, somber day, and the truth is it's a happy day because this is a day of forgiveness and expiation. There's actually a very famous and often misinterpreted continuation of this Mishnah that tells about what would happen on the 15th day of Av. The daughters of Jerusalem would all dress in white, in borrowed garments, and they would go out to the fields and they would sing and dance. I've heard people say this is like the Jewish Valentine's Day. It's not the Jewish Valentine's Day. Okay, we don't have Valentine's Day. But it is a day of tremendous joy, and also, again, a lot of details on what happened on that day, but it's a day that was instituted as one of happiness and celebration and joy. The book of Megillah talks about the festival of Purim and the reading of the Megillah and when it must be read. And in the book of Megillah, we read about a very interesting law. We know that the festival of Purim happens on the month of Adar. And because we maintain a solar year and a lunar month, which means every month it's 29 and a half days, well, you multiply that by 12, you have a 354 day year. Well, we know that the year is 365 and a quarter days long. Not exactly, it's a little bit shorter than that. It's 365 days and 5 hours and 55 minutes or so. And that's why every 4th year we have to add a February 29th. But not every 100th year. But yes, every 400th year. That's the idea. We know the exact length of a solar year. Well, if our 12 months are only 354 days, we got a problem, because then Passover will not be in the springtime, and Passover must be in the springtime. And thus we have to maintain two different calendars, a solar calendar every year and a lunar calendar every month. And that is balanced out with the intercalation of the calendar, where these two calendars are mixed together. Every 2 or 3 years, we have a second month of Adar, Adar 1 and Adar 2. And more precisely, it's 7 times every 19 years. Every 19 years, we lose 11 days per year, but we add 7 months. You do the math. We synchronize those two calendars. Thankfully, we don't have to do this, but the great, brilliant minds of the Sanhedrin and of the sages, they do the work for us. We just follow the calendar sent to us in the mail by torch, of course. But what happens if it's the month of Adar? Oh, it's Purim time. Let's celebrate. Let's get dressed up and give Mishlach Manos and read the Megillah and so on. And it turns out, well, actually, this was Adar 1. This is a year of 2 Adars, Adar 1 and Adar 2. And thus Purim should be celebrated on the next month of Adar. That is an interesting dilemma. You could read more about it in the book of Megillah. And the last two are Moed Katan and Chagiga. The book of Moed Katan talks about the laws of Chol HaMoed, which is the intermediate days of festivals. There are 2 7-day-long festivals in our calendar. Pesach, and of course, Sukkot, Sukkos. And those festivals are bookended with 2 festival days, but the days in between are known as Chol HaMoed. It's a festival, but it's also an intermediate day, meaning it's not a full festival. So the book of Moed Katan talks about that. It also talks about the laws of mourning. Those are not necessarily directly linked, but that is the subject matter of the book of Moed Katan. And finally, the book of Chagiga, that talks about the pilgrimages. 3 times a year we are required, not we, all males are required to go to Jerusalem and to bring sacrifices. That's the laws of the pilgrimage. And then there's the laws of purity and impurity that are pertinent to someone who makes the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. This is left for last, the Rambam tells us, because it's obligatory only for males. And the very first Mishnah of the book of Chagiga tells us, Hakol chayavim b're'iyah, everyone is obligated to appear in the pilgrimage in Jerusalem, with some exceptions. A deaf person, deaf-mute, an imbecile, a person of mental incapacities, a katan, a minor, a tumtum, and an androgynous. Tumtum means someone whose gender is not known, meaning that it's covered up. We don't know if they're male or female. And androgynous is an androgynous, someone who has characteristics of male and female. Women, the Torah tells us this is only obligatory for men, not for women. Unfreed slaves, meaning these are people that are Jewish, but they are still enslaved, and therefore they don't quite have freedom of movement. Chiger, which is a lame person, a blind person, a sick person, an elderly person, and someone who cannot walk with their feet to Jerusalem. The Torah tells us, Shalosh regalim, 3 festivals, but the word regalim also means 3 feet. You got to walk to Jerusalem. Well, how young is someone who cannot walk to Jerusalem? Different opinions. According to one opinion, if the child's old enough to go on his father's shoulders, and the father walks him to Jerusalem, well, then he's already obligated to go to the Re'iyah, to the pilgrimage. According to Beis Hillel, according to the second opinion, that he has to be older, a little bit older, he has to be old enough to hold his father's hands to ascend from Jerusalem to Temple Mount, to the temple. And I find this to be a very beautiful image, the idea of a man taking his son either on his shoulders or holding his hand and ascending to the temple to go experience the festivals and the pilgrimage in Jerusalem. May we be so fortunate to merit to witness that in our lifetimes. This is a brief, very, very brief snapshot and overview of the books of the second order of Mishnah, of Seder Moed, the order of the festivals. We still have 4 orders to go. I don't know if you find this as interesting as I do. We always talk about the Torah and the oral Torah and the written Torah and the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, Babylonian Talmud. I think it's important to just actually go through the books, to know the names of the books, and to know which section of Mishnah they fit into. If we want to have a proper introduction, at least to Torah, it's important to at least know some of the components, what makes up the Torah, and what are some of the details in the books, the 60 plus books of the Mishnah. So please God, we will continue, and we will next address the next order, the third order, that, well, I'll leave it as a surprise. What is it? We'll have to wait till next time. The next order of Mishnah. My email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.